stand up for a second. Let's read God's word. We're going to read Colossians 1:15 down to 20. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please sit down. Thank you all for inviting me back. I guess that means I didn't say too much to get me kicked out midweek, so I'm here again for the second Sunday in a row. I want to talk to you a bit about fear and the supremacy of God. Have you ever been afraid? I'm not talking about the momentary fear in the dark or a jump scare in a movie. I'm talking about ongoing anxiety. Fear about what the future might bring. Fear for your marriage or your kids or your health or your economic well-being. Fear about employment prospects, marriage prospects, housing. I Googled housing here, so y'all should at least be afraid of that. I was like, this weather is great. Then I Googled how much it costs to live here, and I was like, I'm heading back to the Midwest. But God bless you. Keep paying those property taxes. Anyways, I grew up. God bless y'all. It's cheaper, but it's just more cold and miserable in the Midwest. Anyways, you pay for your comfort. I grew up without a lot. Raised by a single mom in one of the rougher parts of town. One of those kinds of stories that you know well. But for long periods in my life, I actually wasn't very afraid. I knew that I was up against it, and that if God didn't show up, I was lost. There's kind of a certain reckless hopelessness that grows up in the face of nihilism, where you kind of shrug your shoulders at the statistics and say, you know what, why not me? Why can't I make it? I once lived through a drive-by with bullets flying through my house. And in the midst of that, I never had a panic or anxiety attack. Those anxiety attacks, anyone ever had one? Those came later, after I had built a little bit of a life for myself. I had a good job. I was married to a wonderful woman. I had 4 amazing kids. And it was then that I started to feel fear, because I had something to lose. I had made it high enough where it seemed like the fall down would be devastating and fateful. My wife is a hiker. I am not. I think God made the ground for a reason. Heights are one of my many phobias. I knew that I was in love when in the early years of our marriage, we were living in Japan at the time, she convinced me to climb Mount Fuji. Okay. It takes about 5 to 8 hours going up and about half that coming down. And I think my wife wanted to see the beauty of the sunrise from the top of Mount Fuji, so we took that late afternoon hike where you would climb up halfway during the night, sleep, wake up, and enjoy the glory of God in the sunrise. And once again, I'm in love, so I say yes. And then the sun starts to go down as we climb, and the only light that I had was this headlamp. And I start to realize to myself, this is a really bad idea. But I was too high up to climb back down, and I was afraid to move forward. I was trapped in fear. That's how life feels sometimes. That the way forward, the next day, the next week, the next year feels daunting. and we just don't know what's going to become of our lives. Have you been there, that feeling of vulnerability? Now, everyone's fear is not mine, but our responses to fear can be similar. We look for a place of safety. The church in Colossians had their own set of fears and concerns. And seeing how Paul responded to those fears might be instructive to us. Now, the Colossians had been evangelized by a disciple of Paul named Epaphras. Epaphras seems to have been evangelized by Paul, and then he goes back to his hometown and plants a church. He actually plants the church in the house of Philemon, who we read about last week. And he speaks to the people in Colossae about God's deep love for them and the forgiveness of their sins. He invited them to accept God's gracious offer of forgiveness. They didn't have Alpha, but I'm assuming it was similar, really good food, great coffee, a little bit of Jesus. Okay. And they converted. They heard the gospel and their soul said yes. And I believe they experienced that initial joy when you become a Christian, where it feels like all of your problems have been solved. But after the honeymoon wears off, a new set of problems began to surface. There are two major fears that interrupted the Colossians' lives. The first one were harmful spiritual forces they were afraid might attack them. In the Greco-Roman world, they had this belief in high gods, probably the ones that you hear about on television and in the movies. But they also had lower spiritual forces that could influence your businesses, your health, and your social life. So if someone didn't like you, they could put a curse or a hex on you that would ruin your life. It was a world of negative energy. Manifesting, not exactly the same, but it's there, right? This idea that through their will, they could inflict something on someone else. Even though the Colossians had become Christians, they were still afraid that the gods of the culture might attack them. Let's not sit in judgment. I walked through downtown Santa Monica and I saw the horoscopes and the people who will read your palms and tell you your future. We live in this culture, right, of negative energy. The second fear that they had was spiritual stagnation. Have you ever felt like you've been Christian for a while? Maybe this is what the School of Discipleship is about, that you're stuck and you begin looking for something more. What can I do to take my spirituality to the next level? And this group came in and told the Colossians, if you followed their spiritual program, you get two benefits. The spiritual powers that were attacking you, we could keep them away from you, and you would dramatically improve your spiritual lives. You'd have visions and experiences of worshiping with angels. These people didn't exactly deny Jesus. They just added some elements to it. Some special days of fasting, keeping elements of the Jewish law, adding elements of paganism. They had promised the Christians there, they had found the secret spiritual recipe. It's what I call magic bullet Christianity. And and I know we don't do this here at Vintage because we're all kind and we don't judge any other church. But we'll say, you know what you're missing? Maybe if you're in a church that is not charismatic, you say, you know what you need? You need the gift of the Spirit. And once you get the Holy Spirit, no more problems for you. Or maybe you're in a church that doesn't have hymns. You say, well, you know what you need? You need the spiritual depth of hymns. Or you can say your church is too dry. You need some guitars to get people excited about Jesus. Or maybe you'll say we need the liturgy. Whatever it is, we have this idea that if you follow our program, all of your problems will go away. If you follow us, if you follow our way, or maybe even adopt our politics, you'll be kept safe. Their fears in Colossae are not our fears. But this idea, that this problem that they experienced of the original version of Christianity they experienced was good up to a point. Now you need to change, and the new circumstances feels familiar to us. Growing up as a kid, my church used to buy all of their kind of Christian paraphernalia from everybody else's store. And so that means that we had like the white Jesus that you see in all of the cartoons and all of those things. It was an all-black church with like a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus, kind of like the great hair that you see here in Santa Monica. Best moisturized city in the country. Anyways, we had these pictures of Jesus, And great tan, amazing beard, impeccable haircut, great, perfect. And my mom said, that's probably not good for a black guy to see only white Jesus all of the time. And so she bought me a picture or a painting of black Jesus. Jesus had an afro. All of the disciples were like black, and like people were being baptized, they were black. And I had this picture on the wall the entirety of my childhood. And when it got time for me to go to college, you go to college and you pack up your stuff. And you start trying to figure out, well, what is going to come with me on this new college campus? I remember standing in front of black Jesus. I don't know how this is gonna fit on this all-white college. I took him, by the way, but anyways. The question isn't whether or not we're gonna bring black Jesus or white Jesus to college. It's just whether or not the faith that we received at some point in our lives are sufficient for the new situation. Are we gonna continue to carry the gospel they received into new context? For what they wanted from the Colossians, the people who were trying to influence them, was not a rejection of Christianity, but an amendment. Add in elements of paganism, fear of minor deities, add in elements of the Jewish law, add in their own special fasting, syncretism. What they said was that the Colossians needed a mix of religion that they had created that would be more acceptable in the society that they were engaging in. So does any of this feel familiar, right? People don't want us to reject Jesus, just adjust him a little bit. And there was an added bonus that if they did adopt their version of Jesus, they'd get visions of angels, worship with the heavenly host, a new spirituality, blessings. Abandon Paul and early Christianity's teachings, and their careers and their lives would be better. Can I be honest? Sometimes the day-to-day, wake up, read your Bible, pray, attend church, volunteer, try to be a Christian in your job and in your life can feel a little bit boring. And we wonder, is there more? Is there something we're missing out on? And what does Paul say to this church that is suffering this kind of fear and anxiety about the future and who've been offering a different version of Jesus to suit their needs? Paul gives the Colossians probably one of the most robustly Christological articulations of who Jesus is. In the midst of their fears, he does not give them a strategy. He talks to them about a person. He says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things are created, things in heaven and on earth, whether visible or invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authority, all things are created through him and for him. Paul reminds the Colossians that humankind was made in the image of God, and they were made to reflect him in the world. One of the things that I've noticed by traveling to different places is that every city and culture has an image or a way of being, and they try to force you to. I remember when I had been in the academy for about 4 to 6 years, and I randomly had this idea, you know what? Khaki pants and blue blazers, that kind of looks good. The elbow patches, I've never really appreciated them. You know why? Because everybody had an elbow patch. I've been here in Santa Monica, and I will just say, shoes here, impeccable, great tennis shoe game, amazing haircuts, and you are, like I said, the best moisturized city in the country. I was thinking, I've been here for 4 days, I started Googling skincare routines. I need to pull myself together. It's like I'm underdressed for a jog. I felt like anyways, never mind. And I just imagine there's ways, not just clothes, but the ways of living and being that this culture forces you into. The values they inculcate implicitly that direct your life. Every city, every culture has an image and a way of life that they try to force you into. Deeper than clothes, but a way of life. We try to become that. The scriptures, though, tell us it's not our job to reflect the cultures in which we live. It's not even our job to find the perfect vocation or place of business to work. Our job is to reflect God's image, God's way of being, God's way of life in the world. You can't fail at that. The narrative of Scripture reveals how often we fail in that vocation. Rather than reflecting God, we reflect our own brokenness, our own greed, our own thirst for power. There's this deep cynicism that's affecting the younger generation. We're cynical about politics, about church, about business, about economics, about everything. Probably because we have assumed or seen, rightfully so, the people who said that they cared about us have actually had only their desires in mind. Humankind has been tried, examined, been found wanting. There's this reason that whatever politician it is that we support, we often turn them into memes. We put them in superhero uniforms because we believe that maybe they can save us. There's this passage in Revelation 5 that I've always found quite moving. It pictures the Apostle John in heaven, and John sees a vision of a scroll. And on that scroll, it has all of human history. Everything that's going to happen from that moment until the end of time. And the scroll is locked. And they ask this question, who is worthy to open the scroll? Who is actually worthy to unfurl or unroll human history so that it ends up in the proper place? And the statement that they said is they looked in heaven and on earth, they looked everywhere, and no one was worthy to open the scroll. And John weeps. He just weeps. He weeps because if there's no one who's in charge of human history, if there's no one who can direct us to the fulfilling of who we're supposed to be, then all is lost. And sometimes I felt that deep weeping. Who can I turn to and trust who's going to show me what it means to follow the good, the true, and the beautiful? John's weeping only stops when he sees an image of the lion and the lamb. Paul tells us that Christ is the image of God. If you want to know what God looks like, what it looks like to reflect God in the world, you look at Jesus' own life, in his compassion, his concern for the poor, and his lifting up of women, of his calling everybody to relationship with him, and his vision of the holy life before God on the Sermon on the Mount. If you want to know what the good, the true, and the beautiful looks like, you look to Jesus. Even in the face of our rejection of him, he shows us love. That Christ does what we could not do. He reflects God in the world. Now, have you all seen Inception? Okay, at least I'm not going to summarize the plot because I don't think you can. But I'll at least refer to it in this way. What Paul is actually saying is almost an Inception level mind bend. Because he says that human beings were made in God's image. But then he says Christ is the image of God, which means that humankind was made after the image of Christ, who comes later in history. That it's when we see Jesus, we see what we're supposed to be from the beginning. The image of God is not found in reflecting Adam, but in Jesus. The one who came later is also the one who came before all things. Christ is both the means of creation. All things are created through him, and he is the end or purpose of creation. All things are created for him. That includes everything. There is nothing that exists outside of his dominion. There is no fear or no need to fear any spiritual power, as if that power could rival Christ. In other words, Paul is saying Christ is never out of control. He never panics. There are no committee meetings in heaven. Have you thought about that? There's no strategy meetings. Jesus doesn't sit in heaven and say, you know what? Someone published a really good book saying that I don't exist. He calls Michael and the angels, what are we going to do? He is utterly confident in his existence. He sees the turmoil in our culture. And he doesn't go, man, they're lost. He is fine. The ascension and reign of Christ is not a minor piece of Christian doctrine. It is the source of our hope. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that if you trust Jesus, all anxiety goes away. Go to therapy. We'll talk about that in a minute. I'm talking about the hope in the context about therapy. Paul says this other thing. He says that Christ is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is called an argument from greater to lesser. Paul argues that Christ isn't simply the person who created all things. He's not just the one who created it, but he's the one who sustains creation. And if Christ were to forever take his hands off the wheel, that everything that we know is spin out of existence. He didn't just create us and step back. He keeps the universe going at every moment. And the point of that is, if God has sufficient power to keep the universe in existence, maybe he has sufficient power to solve your problems. Have you ever felt like your life was unraveling? That your emotions were fried? That you couldn't think straight? That you always thought that something like sanity was something that you could hold on to, but you felt the edge of your limits in sight? What was it that pulled you back from the brink? Paul would argue that it was the power of God. The power that God used in creation was directed towards you to keep you from losing everything. I remember when I was in college, I was in graduate school. I did a PhD at the University of St. Andrews. I studied under the name of this guy who some of you will know, some of you won't. His name's N.T. Wright. He's really, for those of you who never heard of him, he's really, really smart. He's way smarter than me. And every month, I'd sit down and I'd have a meeting with him for like 60 to 90 minutes. And I was trying my best not to sound stupid. That was my goal at every meeting. And I remember thinking that I am going to flunk out. I cannot do it. And you ever been to this, maybe you've been this way, you've been this nihilistic where you're thinking, well, how can I spin this on a Facebook post? I went off to graduate school, but now I'm returning home to be with family. Anyways, I remember I would go jogging, and I preached the gospel to myself over and over and over and over again. And I would try to remember that the God who saved me was the God who could keep me. That when it felt like things were unraveling, I tried to remember the power of God. One of the things that trauma does and fear does, it lowers our gaze. All we can see is the object of our concern. It is all consuming. We forget everything that happened before, and we can't imagine anything that might come after. Our entire testimony is washed away in the face of this impending disaster. I must be honest. I think the next 6 to 12 months in this country are going to be a bit rocky. The witness of the church, in many ways, seems compromised. We are divided. Our politics are off the rails. But I know that God is in charge because I believe the tomb was empty that first Sunday morning. In the midst of our fears, Paul calls upon the people in Colossae to lift their eyes to Jesus. Not just to stare at your fear, but to get a vision of Christ. And like I said, this is not in the place of therapy or counseling. I'm not saying that you can just pray away all your fears or pray away all of your sadness. I'm saying that a source of hope in your counseling and your therapy is the power of God, and that your healing doesn't simply depend upon you. Paul concludes by saying that Christ is the head of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. But God was pleased to reconcile all things through him, making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Paul switches from Christ's role in creation. Remember, the power that God worked at creation, he says, is directed towards you. And then he switches to Christ's role in redemption. That Christ, no one else, is the head of the church. I wish I could promise you there's going to be no Christian that you're going to see at any point over the next 6 to 12 months who are going to make you shake your head in despair, but that would be a lie. You will. But I will remind you that those people are not in charge of the church. Jesus is. Paul uses the word head here, and Christian theologians argue about what that word head might mean. Some people think that it means boss. Christ is the head in the sense that he's in charge of everything. But another way of understanding, or an alternative way of understanding it, is that Christ is the source, kind of like when you have a source of a river from which all the other tributaries flow out. Or like we think about the roots when you grow up. I think Paul has in mind here both. That Christ is the source of our life. All that we have flows from our relationship with Christ. But he's directing our growth so that we might become like him. Why do we follow Christ, according to Paul? In the midst of a culture that fills us with fear? He says Christ was supreme in creation. He's the reason why we exist. But he's also supreme in redemption. When we went astray from him, the great love of our souls sought us and won us through his blood on the cross. That Paul reminds him that he is God completely. In a world of competing allegiances and people promising them safety, Paul had a simple message for the people in Colossae. So simple that it might be disappointing. You say, why did you fly him all the way out from Chicago to tell you this? But I'm here now. God reigns supreme over whatever it is that troubles you. That in the midst of your fear or your anxiety, remember the supremacy of the God that you serve. The world is a very scary place, and we can feel this desire to seek safety in the variety of beliefs and circumstances. Now, I don't want you to forego wisdom. I'm not saying I trust Jesus, so I'm not going to pay my bills. I'm assuming they will kick you out. Right? But I am saying what Paul reminded the church of Colossae of. That following Jesus and being found in Jesus is the great achievement of your life. You've already won. And if anyone tells you need anything in addition to Christ, no matter how well-intentioned they may be, they are wrong. Christ was sufficient in the past. He is sufficient now. And he is sufficient to carry you from this point to the end of your lives. Thank you.